We hadn't always been here, but the neighborhood has. Even before it was a neighborhood on Earth, this one has been here. Here, for those that would be lost on those cursed grounds. Here, for those who would die long before their real life ever truly began. Here, for those who never really wanted to grow up. We come from different times and we come from different lives, but one thing remains true for all of us. We lived on the earthly realm of the neighborhood at some point in our lives and died long before our time was supposed to come. We don't remember much of our lives in the cul-de-sac since the last member of our group joined us, and we certainly won't remember now when the next spirit comes, but here's what we do know. Rolf was the first to come here. Unlike most of us, he was born in far-off lands, and even in the afterlife he hasn't lost the touch of his old-world upbringing. He moved to the neighborhood in 1889, before it was developed. The son of a shepherd, he and the rest of his family came to start a farm on the land that would soon turn into the place we would all eventually reside in. He died in 1893. While tending to the family's animals, the bull broke loose from its pen, and, in Rolf's efforts to stop the beast, he was trampled to death. That is why, even though he brought many of his family's livestock with him in spirit, he chose not to bring the cattle along. He continues to go about the farm's business on a daily basis, but is more than happy to occasionally neglect them to play with the other children of the neighborhood. Johnny was always a lonely child. In fact, Rolf actually became his first human friend ever when he came to the cul-de-sac in 1908, 15 years after Rolf's death. His parents moved onto the grounds of Rolf's former farm not long after his death. With no other children around and no field work to take up his time, as it did with Rolf's, Johnny drew into his own mind for a great extent. And that is how Plank was born. Together they wandered about the countryside, climbing trees and getting themselves into trouble. Sadly, this didn't last forever, as a few years later, Johnny became bedridden with illness. In 1912, he died after a long battle with tuberculosis. He saw his imaginary friend Plank standing by him to his last breath. Even now in the afterlife, without the countryside to play in, Johnny still wastes much of his time frolicking through the backyard and streets. Eddie was the next to come. Eddie was born in New York City, but moved to the neighborhood in 1922, just as the roaring 20s was hitting full swing. The neighborhood, while still different, was beginning to take form from the fields of its past as families moved in and split up the lands that had once belonged to Rolf's family. Always a schemer, Eddie looked to do anything to bring some comfort to his very bare family life, even if it cost him the friendship of others. Eddie died in 1929 after one of his grand plans to swindle a sap backfired. He drowned trying to cross the local river after trying to run away from the angry kids that he had tried to deceive. Even in the afterlife, he keeps chasing after the almighty dollar. Sarah and Ed moved to the cul-de-sac in 1983. By the late 30s, the cul-de-sac had already nearly taken its final form as one of the pre-planned developments that had become popular in the pre-war era. As brother and sister growing up in the chaos of World War II, they both had various ways of escaping their lives as children of a World War I ace and a working mother. Sarah became enraged and controlling as she sought to make sure that everyone around her knew that she was in charge, all in an attempt to copy off her view of the hustle and bustle of her often working mother. Ed, on the other hand, went about it in a different way. He just shut it out entirely. In fact, he shut out nearly everyone and everything in the world, entirely becoming what appeared to be a complete idiot. Ed chose instead to become completely involved in the monster movies and comic books that began to pop up after the war had ended. It wasn't too long after this that, in 1943, Ed and Sarah died in a car wreck as their drunken uncle was driving them to visit their grandparents. Naz came a time after the brother and sister. Naz was a flower child and turned establishment in 1958. She was a naturally beautiful girl that had always had a way with boys and men alike. She lived life on a whim and would often go about flirting and playing without any intentions. She died in possibly the most horrible way of any of the children in the neighborhood. In the summer of 1969, a serial killer who had broken out of a local asylum had slipped into her house in the dead of night and raped and killed her, along with her entire family. In the trauma of these events, she, in a way similar to Ed, shut out the world entirely and forgot her parents and siblings, which is why in the afterlife she doesn't ever receive demands from the non-existent parents, unlike many of the others. This gives her much more time to lounge around and party as often as she wants. It doesn't take too long before Ed joins the rest of the neighborhood, in 1972. He was the child of two highly controlling professionals in the age of greed that, despite their constant absence, dominated his life. As such, Ed became quite the intellectual and a rather meek and shy figure. Always the curious type, he loved to experiment when given the time away from school and the constant chores of his parents. This would lead him to his untimely demise in 1976, as a gas leak combined with a Bunsen burner from one of his experiments tore him and his house to pieces. Being the timid and superviant type, between various misadventures, Ed continues to follow the written orders of his parents long after his death. Kevin was the next to join the group when he moved to the cul-de-sac in 1981. He was born to the day of Ed's death and is in many ways his polar opposite. Kevin came from a broken home and developed a bold personality. In life, he was cynical and angry, and took it out on many of the other children. His abusive father would rarely pay him any attention in life, and would end up bringing about the end of it. In a drunken rage, his father beat him after Kevin attempted to stand up to him. He died on the way to the hospital in the winter of 1989. His father spent the rest of his life in prison. In the afterlife, Kevin changed his perception to the opposite of what life really was, with a distant father who would shower him with gifts. However, he continued to maintain his bullying, even in death. Jimmy was the last to come to the cul-de-sac. He moved to the cul-de-sac in 1987, and into the house where Naz once lived. He was very overprotected by his parents, often locking him up in his room for hours and not letting him socialize with the other children. Jimmy's parents' worst fears were realized when in 1988 he was diagnosed with severe leukemia. Jimmy lingered for the final part of 1988 and all of 1989 in a state of near death, until finally, on New Year's Day, 1990, he passed away. The Kankert sisters were different from any other denizens of the cul-de-sac. They were never of the earthly plane of existence. Instead, they are the children of demons, not too dissimilar from the succubane of human law. They seem to possess abilities impossible by the standards of others, such as the ability to appear nearly anywhere instantly. They were sent from hell to torment the already tortured souls of the neighborhood. Surprisingly, they are attracted to the Eds for unknown reasons. Although, It's speculated that they are the weakest willed members of the neighborhood, and are seen as easy targets by them. Despite that, they are universally loathed and often feared by everyone, including the Eds. In 1991, to prevent any other deaths, the town was quarantined by the FBI and the US Army. They also did it to prevent any Al-Qaeda activity, just to see if any terrorists will talk about their plans there. But the only activity there in the cul-de-sac was paranormal activity. Many of ghost hunters that went to the cul-de-sac have been reporting sounds of children, stuff moving around, and they even saw the ghosts of animals that belonged to Rolf. In 1999, the FBI lifted the quarantine off the cul-de-sac, and they found nothing related to what they were looking for. In 2003, on the 110th anniversary of Rolf's death, the last family left the cul-de-sac. Ever since then, the cul-de-sac has been abandoned and a warm spot for ghosts. But mostly, the Eds.